I survived Afghanistan, 12-hour shifts guarding the Queen, but nothing prepared me for the day my neighbor Karen decided my driveway was a threat to national security. Let me introduce myself properly. For 22 years, I serve as a member of the Queen's, and now King's, Guard at Buckingham Palace. Not the chaps in the red tunics and bearskin hats that tourists love to photograph. Mind you, I was what we call a proper guard, the ones in tactical gear that you don't see in the brochures. The ones who actually deal with threats rather than stand perfectly still while American teenagers try to make us laugh. After more than 2 decades of service, including 3 tours overseas that I'm not at liberty to discuss, let's just say I've got medals I keep in a drawer that I never talk about. I finally retired last year. My knees aren't what they used to be, and frankly, I'd had enough of London's chaos. I wanted nothing more than a quiet life in a sleepy village where the most exciting thing might be a sheep wandering into someone's garden. I found the perfect little cottage in a quaint village called Millfield, about 2 hours outside of London. It's the sort of place where everyone knows everyone. The local pub serves a proper Sunday roast, and people still leave their doors unlocked at night. The cottage itself was a charming stone building with climbing roses and a garden that needed some serious TLC, but I saw the potential immediately. The previous owner, an elderly widow named Mrs. Harrington, had lived there for 50 years. When I bought it, the place needed significant updating. The bathroom was straight out of the 1970s with avocado-colored fixtures, and the kitchen had an ancient Aga cooker that probably predated my birth. But the bones were good, and I had my army pension plus savings to make it a proper home. The first month was pure bliss. I installed a fancy espresso machine. Old habits die hard. We guards run on caffeine, planted vegetables in the back garden, and even adopted an enormous Maine Coon cat from the local shelter. I named him Wellington, after the Duke, not the boots, though he's certainly the size of a pear. He spends most days sprawled across whatever surface I'm trying to use, shedding ginger fur onto my dark clothing with almost military precision. My neighbors to the left were a lovely retired couple, the Hendersons, who brought over a Victoria sponge cake when I moved in. To my right was an empty cottage that had been on the market for ages. Been empty for 2 years, Mr. Henderson told me over tea. Bit overpriced for what it is, but the estate agent's stubborn. Life was peaceful. I established a routine. Morning jog around the village green, coffee in the garden while reading the newspaper, afternoon spent restoring furniture I'd pick up at estate sales, and evenings at the pub or watching history documentaries with Wellington purring like a diesel engine on my lap. Then SG moved in. I should have known trouble was brewing when the moving van arrived at 6 a.m. on a Sunday. Who does that? In a village like Millfield, that's practically a declaration of war. The Hendersons and I exchanged glances over our garden fences as the racket continued for hours. My first proper sighting of Karen, not her real name, but you'll see why it fits, was as she marched up to my front door that very afternoon, clipboard in hand, pearls bouncing against her cashmere twin set, blonde bob swinging with self-importance. "Hello," she announced before I could even greet her. "I'm Marjorie Winters, your new neighbor. I've been appointed to the Village Preservation Committee, and I'm conducting a survey of properties that may not be up to historical code. No, pleased to meet you. No housewarming gift. Just straight to the clipboard." "James Wright," I replied, extending my hand. "Pleasure to meet you." She looked at my hand as if I might be offering her a dead fish, then reluctantly shook it with just her fingertips. "Yes, well, I couldn't help but notice your driveway appears to be non-regulation width. The Historical Society guidelines clearly state that driveways in the conservation area must not exceed 2.4 meters in width. Yours appears to be at least 2.5, possibly 2.6. I blinked slowly. 22 years of guard training teaches you how to keep a straight face when tourists are making obscene gestures, trying to get reaction. This was child's play in comparison. "The driveway was here when I bought the place," I explained calmly. "Mrs. Harrington had it widened slightly in the 90s, I believe, to accommodate her son's car when he visited. It was all properly approved by the council at the time." Karen sniffed. "Well, regulations change. I'll need to measure it properly and file a report." Before I could respond, she was marching down my garden path, producing a measuring tape from her handbag like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. I followed, bemused, as she got down on her hands and knees in her pristine cream-colored trousers to measure my gravel driveway. 2.55 meters, she announced triumphantly, as if she'd just discovered nuclear fusion. "That's definitely non-regulation. You'll be receiving a formal notice." "A formal notice for 5 centimeters of gravel?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Surely there are bigger issues in the village. The pub sign is hanging crooked, for instance. Her eyes narrowed. This isn't a joking matter, Mr. Wright. Historical preservation is what keeps property values from plummeting. I moved here from Kensington to get away from people who don't respect tradition and rules. Ah, a Londoner. That explains a lot. Well, I'm sure we can sort something out, I said, trying for diplomacy. Would you like to come in for tea? Get to know each other a bit. I don't have time for socializing, Mr. Wright. I have 17 other properties to inspect today. With that, she spun on her sensible heels and marched back to her cottage, leaving me standing in my apparently criminal driveway. Little did I know that this was just the opening salvo in what would become the Great Driveway War of Millfield. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door, printed on heavy cream stationery with "From the desk of Marjorie Winters," emblazoned at the top in swirly gold font. Dear Mr. Wright, it read. After consultation with my copy of the Millfield Conservation Area Guidelines, 2018 edition, I must formally request that you reduce your driveway width to the regulation 2.4 meters within 30 days. Failure to comply may result in council action. For your convenience, I've included the business card of a reputable landscaper who specializes in historical restorations. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. 22 years of service had taught me to pick my battles carefully. This wasn't one worth fighting yet. Wellington rubbed against my legs, demanding breakfast, and completely unaware that his territory was under threat from a woman with a measuring tape and too much time on her hands. Just between us, Welly, I told him as I spooned premium cat food in his bowl, I think we may have a situation developing next door. Little did I know just how right I was. The passive-aggressive notes quickly became a daily occurrence. Each morning, I'd find a new one, each more elaborate than the last. They graduated from heavy cream stationery to laminated full-color printouts with highlighted sections of the village code. Perhaps you're unaware, one particularly condescending note read that as per Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Millfield Historical Preservation Bylaws, all exterior modifications must maintain the aesthetic integrity of properties built before 1900. Your bird feeder, spotted hanging from your oak tree, is made of plastic, which wasn't invented until the 20th century and therefore constitutes a historical anachronism. I'd served under commanding officers with less attention to detail. After a week of this paper bombardment, I decided to try the neighborly approach one more time. I baked scones, bought them from the village bakery and artfully arranged them on a plate, and knocked on her door one Sunday afternoon. She answered wearing rubber gloves and holding a spray bottle of what smelled like industrial-strength bleach. Behind her, I could see that her cottage interior looked like a museum. Plastic covers on the furniture, not a speck of dust, and absolutely no sign that an actual human lived there. Yes, she said, eyeing my plate of scones suspiciously. I thought perhaps we could have a chat. Neighbor to neighbor, I said, offering my most diplomatic smile, the one I'd used when dealing with foreign dignitaries at the palace. These are from Millfield Bakery. Their lemon curd is rather famous locally. I don't eat sugar, she replied flatly. It causes inflammation. Right. Well, perhaps just a cup of tea, then? I wanted to discuss the notes you've been leaving. Her posture stiffened even further, if that was possible. Have you come to inform me that you'll be restoring your driveway to proper historical dimensions? Actually, I wanted to explain that the driveway was approved by the previous council. I found the paperwork in Mrs. Harrington's files. It seems there was a special dispensation due to her son's disability. He needed the extra space to maneuver his wheelchair. This was, I confess, a small white lie. There was indeed paperwork, but it was simply a standard approval. I'd served the Crown long enough to know that sometimes a strategic application of information could defuse a situation. Karen's eyes narrowed. I'd like to see this paperwork. Of course. I'll make a copy for you tomorrow. But while I'm here, I was hoping we could clear the air. I value good relationships with my neighbors and I value rule following, she interrupted. Millfield has standards, Mr. Wright. I moved here specifically because it's a traditional English village that respects heritage and order. The last place I lived, my neighbor installed a satellite dish. A satellite dish, visible from the street. Property values plummeted by 0.25% that quarter. She said satellite dish the way most people might say open sewage pit. I understand your concerns, I said, drawing on all my diplomatic training. But surely there's room for both preservation and practical modern living. Mrs. Harrington lived here for 50 years and was beloved in the village. She made certain choices for her comfort and accessibility, all with proper approval. Karen's lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. Rules are rules, Mr. Wright. Without them, we have chaos. Anarchy. I've already submitted my first report to the council about your driveway. I'll be following up with concerns about your bird feeder, the unauthorized garden gnome by your pond, and the satellite dish on your roof. I didn't have the heart to tell her that what she thought was a satellite dish was actually just a Victorian chimney cap. I see, I said, still holding my rejected plate of scones. Well, I hope the council considers the history and context of these violations. They always side with preservation, she said with smug confidence. Always. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm in the middle of sterilizing my kitchen countertops. The door closed firmly in my face. Over the next few weeks, Karen's campaign expanded beyond notes to include daily calls to the village council. I know this because Janice, who works at the council office, is the sister of Martin, who runs the pub. In a village the size of Millfield, there are no secrets. She's driving us bonkers, Janice told me over a pint one evening. Called 6 times today. Started with your driveway, then moved on to Mr. Peterson's garden shed being the wrong shade of green, Mrs. Thompson's clothesline being visible from the road, and the fact that the signpost on the village green is apparently 2 centimeters shorter than regulation height. Sorry to be causing you trouble, I said, genuinely apologetic. Janice waved away my concern. Not your fault, love. We get one like her every few years. Usually Londoners who move here with some romantic notion of perfect village life, then try to remake everything to their liking. She leaned in conspiratorially. Between you and me, we've started a game in the office. Every time she calls, we put a penny in a jar. End of the month, we use it to buy cakes. Must be quite a collection by now, I laughed. We're considering upgrading to a biscuit tin. She winked. Don't worry too much. Your paperwork is all in order. She can submit all the complaints she wants, but the council isn't going to force you to tear up your driveway for the sake of a few centimeters. Reassured, I returned home, only to find a new laminated notice taped to my front door. This one included photographs of my property with red circles and arrows pointing to various violations, complete with relevant code sections printed in bold. Wellington gave me his usual judgmental look as I added it to the growing collection in my kitchen drawer. Not worth getting worked up about, Welly, I told him as I scratched behind his ears. I've dealt with actual terrorists. I can handle one neighborhood busybody. But Karen was just getting started. The next escalation came when I was repainting my front door. The original color had been a faded royal blue, and I was refreshing it with the exact same shade. I'd even gone to the trouble of finding a heritage paint company that specialized in historically accurate colors. I was halfway through the final coat when a throat-clearing sound made me turn around. There stood Karen with her clipboard and a police constable who looked about 12 years old and thoroughly uncomfortable. "This is Constable Phillips," Karen announced. "I've reported your unauthorized exterior modifications." The young officer gave me an apologetic look. "Sorry to bother you, sir. We received a call about potential violations of conservation area regulations." I carefully put down my paintbrush. "I'm painting my door the exact same color it's been for the past century, Constable. I even matched the paint chip to the original." "He didn't submit Form EC-17B for exterior color maintenance," Karen interjected. "And I have reason to believe he's using non-period appropriate paint with modern polymers." The poor constable looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. "Right, well, that would be a council matter, ma'am, not a police one. Unless there's some other issue." "There most certainly is," Karen insisted. "I believe he's intentionally disrupting the historical aesthetic of the village, which constitutes antisocial behavior under the 2014 amendments to the Public Order Act." I had to admire her creativity, if nothing else. "Ma'am," the constable said with the patience of a saint, "repainting a door the same color is not antisocial behavior by any legal definition. But, is there anything else, ma'am? Any actual criminal activity you'd like to report?" Karen's face reddened. "Well, I've observed suspicious coming and goings. Men in military-looking clothing. They could be planning something." Now it was my turn to redden, but from suppressed laughter. She was referring to my former colleagues from the Guard who occasionally visited for dinner. "Those would be my friends, Constable. Former military colleagues. We get together for dinner and reminisce about the old days." The constable nodded, clearly relieved there was a simple explanation. "Right then. Doesn't sound like there's any police matter here. Ma'am, I'd advise you to direct any conservation concerns to the proper council department." He tipped his hat to me. "Sorry to have disturbed you, sir. Door's looking grand, by the way. Nice shade of blue." As he walked away, Karen fixed me with a glare that would have frozen lava. "This isn't over, Mr. Wright. Not by a long shot." And she was right. It wasn't over. In fact, it was about to get much, much worse. The real showdown began, ironically enough, because of something completely unrelated to my criminal driveway. Every year on the anniversary of our unit's formation, those of us who serve together in the Queen's Guard hold a reunion. Usually, it's in London at our old favorite pub, but this year, since I had the garden and the village was actually quite picturesque, I'd volunteer to host. 20 former guards, some still serving in various capacities, would be descending on my cottage for a weekend of reminiscing, drinking, and the kind of dark humor that only develops when you've spent years standing still while tourists try to make you laugh by doing increasingly ridiculous things in front of you. I'd warned the Hendersons, of course. Might be a bit noisy Saturday afternoon and evening, I told them. Former colleagues coming for a reunion. You're welcome to join us if you'd like. There'll be plenty of food and drink. Mrs. Henderson had immediately insisted on baking several of her famous pies for the occasion, and Mr. Henderson offered to lend me his larger grill. "Been looking forward to meeting your old mates," he said cheerfully. "Always wanted to ask how you lot managed to stand so still for so long without needing the loo." I did not, however, warn Karen. After the incident with the constable, she'd escalated to reporting me to the Environmental Health Department for improper waste bin placement and the Highways Agency for unauthorized vegetation encroaching on public walkways. That would be my rosebush, which had the audacity to bloom enthusiastically over my garden wall. The day of the reunion arrived, bringing unseasonably good weather and high spirits. My former colleagues began arriving around noon, many carpooling together from London. Most came in civilian clothes, though a few wore regimental ties or blazers with subtle military insignia. Nothing flashy, but recognizable to those who knew what to look for. The garden was soon filled with burly men and women, many with the ramrod-straight posture that never quite leaves you after years in the Guards. There was laughter, the occasional shouted military joke, and the smell of good food cooking on the borrowed grill. The Hendersons joined us, clearly delighted to be included. Mrs. Henderson was in her element, serving her pies and collecting compliments. Mr. Henderson had cornered my former sergeant, peppering him with questions about palace protocol. It was, in short, a perfect afternoon, until precisely 3:17 p.m. when Karen made her grand entrance. I should mention that one of our reunion traditions involves a bit of ceremony. Each year, we conduct a small, private toast to fallen comrades. For this, as a mark of respect, a few of us change into our dress uniforms. Not the full bearskin and red tunic, just the formal blues with medals. It's our way of honoring those no longer with us. 3 of my colleagues had just emerged from my cottage in these dress uniforms when Karen appeared at the garden gate, cell phone in hand, frantically taking photos. "I knew it," she screeched, loud enough to silence all conversation. "A paramilitary gathering. In our village." Every head turned toward the gate. 20 pairs of eyes, belonging to some of the most highly trained security personnel in Britain, assessed the threat and, finding it to be a middle-aged woman in a twin set, visibly relaxed. "Afternoon," I said calmly, walking over to her. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I'm documenting everything," she said, still taking photos. "Unauthorized assembly, impersonating royal guards, potential treason." "Oh yes, I've got it all." One of my friends, a mountain of a man named Bill who now worked in diplomatic security, leaned over to me. "Friend of yours, James?" "My neighbor," I explained. "She has concerns about my driveway width." A ripple of laughter spread through the group, which only seemed to inflame Karen further. "This is no laughing matter. You're all under citizen's arrest until the authorities arrive." At this point, Major Blackwood, my former commanding officer and the highest-ranking person present, stepped forward. Despite being in his 60s, he still had the bearing that could make recruits stand to attention from 50 paces. "Madam," he said in the quiet, authoritative tone that had once commanded hundreds of guards, "this is a private gathering of veterans on private property. We are celebrating our unit's anniversary and remembering those we've lost. I suggest you return to your home and allow us to continue our memorial in peace." For a brief, hopeful moment, I thought Karen might actually be sensible enough to back down when confronted with the major's authority. I was wrong. "Veterans," she scoffed. "Likely story. You're imposters. I know what the Queen's Guards look like. They wear the tall, furry hats. None of you have those, which prove you're fakes. I've already called the police and reported a suspicious gathering of men in fake uniforms plotting who knows in our quiet village. Major Blackwood's eyebrows rose so high they nearly left his forehead. Madam, the bearskin caps are ceremonial dress worn only on duty. What you're seeing are the standard blues, formal dress uniforms worn for official functions. Liars! Karen was now fully committed to her conspiracy theory. I've already spoken to the police. They're on their way to arrest all of you for impersonating royal guards and planning sedition. The garden had gone very quiet. 20 highly trained veterans exchanged glances that conveyed an entire conversation without words. The consensus was clear. This woman was several sandwiches short of a picnic. Mrs. Henderson, bless her, tried to intervene. Marjorie, dear, you've got it all wrong. James really was in the guards. These are his former colleagues. It's just a reunion. Stay out of this, Elaine, Karen snapped. You've been taken in by their act. For all we know, they're planning to overthrow the monarchy. At this, a snort of laughter escaped Bill. Overthrow the... Lady, we literally took bullets for the royal family. Some of us still do. A likely story. If you were real guards, you'd be at the palace, not having a barbecue in Millfield. The absurdity of this statement left everyone momentarily speechless. It was during this silence that we heard the approaching police siren. That'll be the authorities, Karen said smugly. I suggest you all prepare to be arrested. Major Blackwood looked at me. James, perhaps you should explain the situation to the constable when he arrives. Might prevent any misunderstandings. I nodded, just as a police car pulled up outside my cottage. The same young constable from the door painting incident emerged, followed by an older officer I didn't recognize. Karen rushed to meet them at the garden gate. Thank goodness you're here, officers. They're all in the back garden. I've documented everything on my phone. The constable saw me and gave a small sigh of recognition. Afternoon, sir. We received a call about suspicious individuals in military uniforms. Fake uniforms, Karen interjected. The older officer stepped forward, surveying the gathering with professional interest. Then his eyes landed on Major Blackwood, and his entire demeanor changed. Major Blackwood? Is that you, sir? The major peered at him for a moment, then broke into a rare smile. Good Lord, young Phillips? Last time I saw you, you were knee-high to a grasshopper. The older officer grinned and stepped forward to shake the major's hand. It's Detective Sergeant Phillips now, sir. Dad always spoke very highly of you. Karen looked back and forth between them, confusion replacing her smugness. You know each other? The major served with my father in the guards, D.S. Phillips explained. And unless I'm very much mistaken, this appears to be a reunion of guards veterans. He looked around the garden, nodding respectfully to the assembled guests, several of whom he seemed to recognize. No, Karen protested. They're imposters. They don't have the proper hats, and they're planning something. Why else would they all gather like this? D.S. Phillips turned to Karen with an expression of infinite patience. Ma'am, I grew up around the guards. My father served for 30 years. What you're seeing here are legitimate veterans in proper dress uniform. The bearskin caps are only worn on duty. But, furthermore, he continued, private gatherings don't require police permission, even from military veterans. Karen was starting to look desperate. But what about his driveway? It's too wide, and he's painted his door without permission. And the young constable, who had been standing awkwardly to the side, cleared his throat. Ma'am, we discussed this. Those are council matters, not police matters. Actually, Mrs. Henderson piped up, the council already reviewed the driveway complaint and found it without merit. The letter came yesterday. She smiled sweetly at Karen. I sit on the planning committee, dear. Karen's face went through a fascinating series of expressions, rather like a kaleidoscope of outrage. This is a conspiracy, she finally declared. You're all in on it together. D.S. Phillips sighed. Ma'am, making false reports to the police is a serious matter. This is now the third time you've called emergency services for non-emergency issues in the past month. But they're distinguished veterans having a private reunion, D.S. Phillips finished firmly. Now, I strongly suggest you return to your home and reconsider your approach to neighborhood relations. Karen stood her ground. I won't be intimidated. I know my rights. I'm making a citizen's arrest right now. She lunged forward and grabbed my arm. James Wright, I'm arresting you for driveway violations, unauthorized door painting, and conspiracy to commit treason. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then several of my former colleagues burst out laughing. Even the young constable was struggling to maintain his professional demeanor. D.S. Phillips, however, was not amused. Ma'am, please release Mr. Wright immediately. Citizens' arrests are only valid when an actual indictable offense has occurred, which is not the case here. What you're doing now could constitute assault. Karen, in her finest moment of judgment yet, responded by trying to produce a pair of novelty handcuffs from her handbag. Where she got them, why she had them, and what she planned to do with them remain mysteries for the ages. That's enough, D.S. Phillips said, all patience gone. Constable, please restrain Mrs. Winters. The young officer stepped forward. Mrs. Winters, I'm arresting you for wasting police time, filing false reports, and assault. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Karen's face went from red to white in an instant. What? No, this is absurd. I'm the one reporting the crime. There is no crime here, ma'am, D.S. Phillips said as the constable gently but firmly took Karen's arms. Except the ones you're committing. As they led a protesting Karen to the police car, D.S. Phillips turned back to the gathering. My apologies for the interruption, gentlemen, ladies. Please continue with your reunion. He nodded respectfully to Major Blackwood. Give my regards to my father when you next speak to him, sir. Certainly will, Phillips. He raised a fine son. As the police car drove away with Karen still visible in the back seat, gesticulating wildly, a silence fell over the garden party. It was broken by Bill, who raised his glass. To James, he announced. 22 years in the Queen's Guard, and he finally managed to get someone arrested instead of doing the arresting. The garden erupted in laughter and cheers as glasses were raised. To narrow driveways and proper door colors, someone else called out, generating another round of laughter. The reunion continued late into the evening, with the Karen incident providing ample material for jokes and storytelling. The Hendersons stayed until well past their usual bedtime. Mrs. Henderson delighted to be collecting Guard's recipes, and Mr. Henderson equally pleased to be collecting Guard's stories. As the last guest departed the following morning, Major Blackwood clasped my shoulder. Outstanding work, right? Most entertaining reunion we've had in years. Just doing my bit for Queen and Country, sir, I replied with a straight face. He chuckled. Indeed. Same time next year. Actually, sir, I said thoughtfully, I hear the cottage next door might be coming on the market soon. Might make a nice weekend place for a distinguished officer. The Major's eyes twinkled. I'll have my estate agent look into it immediately. When Constable Phillips had entered my garden that fateful day, I hadn't immediately connected him to anyone I knew. The Metropolitan Police employs thousands of officers, and while I'd worked alongside many during my service at Buckingham Palace, I couldn't possibly remember them all. But the moment his superior, Detective Sergeant Phillips, recognized Major Blackwood, everything clicked into place. The older officer wasn't just any police officer. He was the son of Colonel Phillips, who had been the Major's right-hand man during some of the most challenging years of our service. Colonel Phillips had been a legend in the Guards, strict but fair, with an encyclopedic knowledge of protocol and a knack for defusing tense situations with unexpected humor. He'd retired about 5 years before I did, after taking a bullet during a state visit that had gone sideways. The bullet had shattered his knee, ending his active service career, but not his dedication to the regiment. He'd moved into a training role, shaping new recruits with the same exacting standards he'd applied to himself. His son, now Detective Sergeant Phillips, had grown up immersed in Guards culture. As a boy, he'd attended countless regimental functions, soaking up the traditions and values that defined our service. I vaguely remembered him as a serious child with his father's sharp eyes and analytical mind. Now, standing in my garden, surrounded by veterans, D.S. Phillips carried himself with the same quiet authority his father had exemplified. He assessed the situation quickly, recognized the absurdity of Karen's claims, and acted decisively, all traits of a good guard. I apologize for the disruption, D.S. Phillips said as his younger colleague escorted a still protesting Karen to the police car. We've had several calls from Mrs. Winters in the past month, but this takes things to a new level. Major Blackwood waved away the apology. No harm done, Phillips. If anything, she's provided us with the most entertainment we've had at one of these gatherings in years. D.S. Phillips smiled wryly. She's new to the village, I understand. Moved in recently from London. Kensington, I confirmed. Apparently came here seeking traditional village life and the strict enforcement of historical preservation codes. Ah, he nodded knowingly. We see that type fairly often. Move to the countryside, expecting midsummer without the murders, then try to reform everything to their liking. Usually settles down after a few months, once they realize village life involves more give and take than they expected. I'm not sure Mrs. Winters grasps the concept of give, remarked Mrs. Henderson, who had joined our conversation. In the 3 weeks she's been here, she's filed complaints against half the village. Even reported the vicar for having the wrong shade of gravel in the church pathway. D.S. Phillips raised an eyebrow. The vicar? Brave woman. Reverend Graham was SAS before he found his calling, wasn't he? That's the rumor, I agreed, though he neither confirms nor denies. Smart man. D.S. Phillips glanced toward the police car, where Karen was visible in the back seat, still gesticulating wildly. I should get back. We'll need to process Mrs. Winters for wasting police time and filing false reports at minimum. The assault charge may not stick, but it gives us grounds to hold her while we sort this out. What happens to her now? Asked Major Blackwood. She'll be taken to the station, formally charged, and likely released on bail pending a court date. First offense, so probably just a stern warning and a fine in the end. But it will establish a pattern of behavior if there are future incidents. He handed me his card. If there's any further trouble, call me directly. Though I suspect after this, she might reconsider her approach to neighborhood relations. I thanked him and shook his hand. Please give your father my regards. Tell him James Wright from B Company asked after him. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Right. Wait. Weren't you the one who caught that intruder trying to scale the palace wall in '08? Dad told that story for years. How you spotted him before any of the security cameras picked him up. I felt my face warm slightly. Just doing my job. Eagle eye and all that. Dad said it was the fastest response he'd ever seen. Man hadn't even got both feet on the wall before you had him in custody. D.S. Phillips shook his head admiringly. He'll be chuffed to know you're living in Millfield now. He and Mum retired to Dorset, but they visit this area occasionally to see me. Perhaps next time they're up, you two could catch up. I'd like that, I said sincerely. As D.S. Phillips returned to the police car, Major Blackwood clapped me on the shoulder. The Phillips men always did have good judgment. Unlike your neighbor. The police car pulled away, Karen's outraged face still visible through the window, and an odd hush fell over the garden. Then Bill, ever reliable for breaking tension, raised his glass. To James, he bellowed. 22 years protecting the Queen, and he's still causing trouble. Laughter rippled through the gathering as glasses were raised in a toast. To narrow driveways and proper door colors, someone else called out, generating another round of laughter. As the party resumed its jovial atmosphere, Mrs. Henderson sidled up to me. You know, she said conspiratorially, Marjorie's been measuring everyone's garden fence heights too. Reported poor Mr. Jameson to the council because his garden shed is apparently 17 centimeters too close to the property line. The man is 87 years old and built that shed with his own hands in the 1970s. I glanced over at Mr. Jameson, one of our village's most beloved residents, who is currently being entertained by two of my former colleagues with tales of palace life. A decorated World War II veteran himself, he'd been delighted to attend the reunion when I'd spotted him on his daily constitutional and extended an invitation. She didn't, I groaned. Oh, she absolutely did, Mrs. Henderson confirmed, lowering her voice further. And that's not all. She's been logging the comings and goings at the pub, claiming they're violating their noise ordinance license by having live music end at 10:02 instead of 10 o'clock sharp. She actually stands outside with a stopwatch. Good grief, I muttered. Has she made any friends here at all? Mrs. Henderson snorted most undignifiedly. Friends? The woman introduced herself to the Women's Institute by presenting a 43-page proposal to modernize the jam competition judging criteria. Suggested we need electronic scales accurate to 1/10 of a gram and blind taste testing booths like they use for wine competitions. I bit my lip to stop from laughing. How'd that go down? About as well as you'd expect. Edith Chambers, you know, she's won the strawberry jam category for 15 years running. Told her that if her palate was so underdeveloped she couldn't tell a good jam by sight and texture, perhaps she should stick to store-bought. By now, I was struggling to maintain my composure. Mrs. Henderson had no such compunctions and was cackling openly. The best part, she continued, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes, is that Karen actually went home and researched jam competitions. Came back to the next meeting with printouts from the International Jam and Preserve Association, which none of us had ever heard of and I strongly suspect she invented, detailing proper judging protocols. And the ladies voted unanimously to ban all electronic devices from the judging tent. Edith suggested we go even more traditional this year and use her grandmother's copper scales from 1906. I lost the battle with my laughter then, drawing curious glances from nearby guests. "You see," Mrs. Henderson said, patting my arm, "you're not her only target. Though I must say, you've certainly become her favorite since you refused to rip up your criminal driveway." "Lucky me," I replied dryly. "Oh, don't worry, dear. After today's performance, I suspect things will quiet down considerably. Nothing subdues a troublemaker quite like the embarrassment of being arrested in front of half the village." How very wrong Mrs. Henderson would prove to be. Part 5. Karen digs deeper. Karen's arrest should have been the end of our neighborhood feud. Most reasonable people, after being escorted away by police, might reconsider their approach to community relations. They might lie low for a while, perhaps even move away to start fresh somewhere new. Karen, as we've established, was not most people. She was released from custody the following morning, having been charged with wasting police time and issued a formal warning. The assault charge had been dropped, presumably because no one could take the novelty handcuffs seriously. D.S. Phillips later told me they were the fluffy pink variety typically found in adult novelty shops, which raised far more questions than I care to have answered about Karen's private life. For 3 blessed days, all was quiet. No notes appeared under my door. No council complaints were filed. The only sign of life from next door was the occasional glimpse of curtains twitching when I went out to collect the mail. "She's regrouping," Mr. Henderson warned when I mentioned the suspicious silence. "Planning her next campaign. Women like that don't surrender easily." He was right, of course. On the 4th day after the garden party incident, I returned from my morning jog to find an official-looking letter in my mailbox. Not from Karen directly. She'd evidently decided to escalate to legal channels. The letter was from a solicitor's firm in London, informing me that they had been engaged by Mrs. Marjorie Winters to pursue action against me for harassment and intimidation, damage to property values through noncompliance with historical preservation codes, emotional distress caused by paramilitary gatherings, defamation of character leading to false arrest. I read the letter twice, then called D.S. Phillips. "She's hired a solicitor," I told him when he rang back, claiming I orchestrated her arrest, among other things. He sighed heavily. "I was afraid of this. Some people simply cannot admit when they're in the wrong." "What should I do?" "Nothing for now. That letter is just posturing. They're fishing to see if you'll panic and offer to settle. There's no actual case here. She was arrested because she falsely reported a crime and then attempted to make a citizen's arrest on false pretenses. So I just ignore it? For the moment, yes. If it progresses to an actual court filing, which I doubt it will, you'll need to respond formally. But these city firms often send threatening letters, hoping for a quick payout from someone who doesn't know better." Reassured, I thanked him and hung up. Wellington, who had been eyeing the letterhead suspiciously from his perch on the kitchen counter, seemed satisfied with this plan and went back to his mid-morning nap. The next day, however, brought a new development. I returned from the village shop to find a man in an expensive-looking suit peering over my garden wall, making notes on a tablet. "Can I help you?" I asked, setting down my grocery bags. He startled slightly, then composed himself. "Ah, Mr. Wright, I presume? Harold Fitzsimmons, property appraiser." He handed me a business card from a London real estate firm. "I've been engaged to assess the impact of code violations on surrounding property values." "By Mrs. Winters, I assume?" He hesitated just long enough to confirm my suspicion. "I'm not at liberty to disclose my client." "Well, Mr. Fitzsimmons, you should know that my property has been inspected by the village council and found to be in full compliance with all relevant codes and regulations. I have the documentation if you'd care to see it." He waved this away. "That won't be necessary. I'm merely conducting a visual assessment." "From outside my property line?" "For now, yes. Though a full assessment would require interior access as well." "Which you don't have and won't be getting," I said firmly. "Now, unless you're planning a trespass, I suggest you take your tablet and your expensive shoes, which are currently sinking into the public verge because it rained last night, and head back to London." His eyes widened slightly in my tone, the one I perfected during my years dealing with particularly persistent tourists who thought it would be hilarious to poke a guard with a selfie stick. "I see. Well, I'll make a note of your refusal to cooperate." "You do that," I replied pleasantly. "And while you're at it, make a note that the village pub serves an excellent plowman's lunch. You might want to try it before you leave, since I doubt you'll be coming back." He departed shortly thereafter, leaving small indentations in the soft ground where his city shoes had indeed sunk into the rain-soaked verge. That evening, I had just settled down with a glass of whiskey and a good book when a thunderous knocking rattled my front door. Wellington, who had been dozing on my lap, shot 3 feet into the air and disappeared upstairs, fur bristling in indignation. I opened the door to find Karen, her face flushed with triumph, clutching a stack of papers. "I've got you now," she announced without preamble. "Proof of your illegal activities." I leaned against the door frame, suddenly very tired. "Mrs. Winters, given that you were recently arrested for harassing me, perhaps this isn't the wisest approach." She thrust the papers toward me. "These are satellite images of your property from the land registry database, showing clearly that your driveway has expanded by approximately 15 square centimeters over the past 5 years, encroaching on protected village green space." I glanced at the top page. It was indeed a satellite image, with various measurements annotated in red ink. "Mrs. Winters. Furthermore," she continued, flipping to the next page, "I've had a professional surveyor confirm that your garden wall is 7.2 centimeters higher on the north corner than regulation height. That would be because the ground slopes. And most damning of all," she declared, producing what appeared to be a grainy photograph, "evidence that you're operating a military training facility from your garden shed." I took the photograph, struggling to make sense of the blurry image. After a moment, I realized what I was looking at. "Mrs. Winters, this is a picture of me cleaning my service medals. For the reunion. A likely story. Those are clearly coded disks for transmitting classified information. I've already submitted this evidence to MI5's tip line." I handed back her evidence with a sigh. "Mrs. Winters, I'm going to say this once, and I hope you'll listen carefully. I have lived a life where I've faced actual threats. People who genuinely wish to do harm to this country and its people. What you're doing right now isn't just annoying or petty. It's taking resources away from real security concerns." Something in my tone must have finally penetrated, because she took a half step back, blinking rapidly. "I understand you value rules and order," I continued more gently. "So do I. I spent my career upholding them. But rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. My driveway being slightly wider than some regulation written in 1953 isn't hurting anyone. It's actually helping, because it allows Mrs. Henderson to park more easily when she brings over her pies." Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. "Now, it's getting late, and my cat is probably hiding under the bed after your enthusiastic knocking. So I'm going to wish you good night, and I sincerely hope we can start fresh tomorrow. Perhaps you might join the Hendersons and me for tea this weekend? Get to know your neighbors as people, not as potential code violators." I closed the door softly before she could respond, leaning against it momentarily as I heard her steps retreat down my garden path. Perhaps, just perhaps, I'd finally gotten through to her. The next morning brought a cease and desist letter from another London law firm, this one specializing in military security breaches. So much for starting fresh. The legal letters continued to arrive, each from a different firm, each making more outlandish claims than the last. I began to suspect that Karen was simply Googling different types of solicitors and sending them all emails filled with her conspiracy theories. D.S. Phillips confirmed my suspicion when he called to check in. "She's contacted 7 different firms in the past week," he told me. "Most haven't taken her seriously, but a few sent form letters just to get her to stop calling them every hour." "How do you know this?" I asked, surprised. "My cousin works at one of the firms. Said they put her on their internal watch list of clients to avoid. Apparently, she's offering to pay their hourly rates with her collection of rare and valuable commemorative Princess Diana plates." I couldn't help but laugh. "Please tell me someone took her up on that." "Sadly, no. The legal profession has some standards." His tone turned more serious. "How are you holding up with all this?" "I've faced worse," I assured him, "though I'm starting to wonder if I should get my own solicitor, just in case. Might not be a bad idea to have one on standby. But honestly, James, none of her claims has any merit. The council has cleared your property of all alleged violations. The police report clearly states she was the instigator at your garden party, and her latest theory that you're running some kind of spy ring from your garden shed is, well, let's call it creative." "That's one word for it," I agreed. After he hung up, I decided it was time for a different approach. Karen wasn't responding to reason, and ignoring her was only causing her to escalate. Perhaps it was time to beat her at her own game. The next day, I visited the village records office. Janice, my insider at the council, was more than happy to help me navigate the archives. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked as she led me through rows of filing cabinets. "Property records for Mrs. Winters' cottage. There's something off about those bay windows she has." They don't match the architectural style of the other cottages from that period. Janice's eyes lit up with mischievous understanding. Now that you mention it, I believe you're right. Let me pull those files for you. An hour later, I left with a very interesting set of photocopies and a spring in my step. The following morning, I knocked on Karen's door at precisely 8 a.m., early enough to be inconvenient, but not so early that she could complain about the time. She answered wearing a dressing gown and curlers, clearly not expecting visitors. "What do you want?" she demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "Good morning, Mrs. Winters. I just wanted to share some interesting historical documents I found during my research yesterday." I held up a folder marked Official Village Records in large, important-looking letters. Curiosity warred with suspicion on her face. Curiosity 1. What documents? These are the original architectural plans for your cottage, dated 1887. Fascinating reading. Did you know that your bay windows were added in 1962 without proper historical approval? And according to the original covenant on the property, your garden wall should be constructed of local stone, not the imported Yorkshire sandstone currently in place. Her face paled slightly. That can't be right. The estate agent assured me everything was original and up to code. "Oh, I'm sure he did," I replied sympathetically. Estate agents aren't known for their deep knowledge of Victorian architectural covenants. But the records are quite clear. I flipped to another page. And then there's the matter of the satellite dish. I don't have a satellite dish. Not now, no. But one was installed in 1997 and removed in 2010, leaving mounting holes in the eastern facade that were filled with non-period appropriate materials. According to Section 17 of the Village Historical Preservation Code, the very same code you've been so diligently enforcing, any such modifications must be restored using original materials and techniques, which in this case would mean hand-mixed lime mortar and reclaimed Victorian brick dust. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times. "But that's ridiculous. I didn't even own the property then." But historical preservation isn't about who did what, is it? It's about maintaining the integrity of the original structure. As the current owner, the responsibility falls to you. I gave her a sympathetic smile. Of course, you could apply for retroactive approval, but the waiting list for the Historical Properties Committee is currently, I checked an imaginary watch, 17 months, and they only approve about 15% of applications on the first submission. All color had drained from Karen's face. 17 months? Give or take. Unless, of course, there was someone on the committee willing to expedite your case. I paused meaningfully. Someone like, say, Mrs. Henderson, who happens to chair the committee this year. "But she hates me," Karen whispered, horrified. Hate is such a strong word. Let's say she's currently disinclined to do you any favors. Though that could change if you were to, I don't know, withdraw all your complaints and legal threats and perhaps bake her an apology cake. I leaned in slightly. Her favorite is Victoria sponge with raspberry jam. Homemade jam, mind you. Store-bought simply won't do. Karen clutched the doorframe for support. "This is blackmail." "Not at all," I replied cheerfully. "This is community. In villages like Millfield, we all have a bit of give and take. You've been doing an awful lot of taking lately, Mrs. Winters. Perhaps it's time for some giving." I handed her the folder. "Here, keep these copies. Take some time to think it over. The committee meets next Tuesday. Mrs. Henderson will need to know by Monday if she's adding your case to the agenda." I turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing. Those garden gnomes you reported Mr. Jameson for? His great-grandson made them in primary school art class. The boy's autistic and visits his great-grandfather every Sunday to make sure the gnomes are still there and happy." The look of utter mortification on Karen's face told me my work was done. I strolled back to my cottage, whistling cheerfully. The next day was Sunday. I spent it peacefully reading in the garden, enjoying the unusual stretch of good weather and Wellington's companionship. No legal letters arrived. No council complaints were filed. The only sound from next door was the occasional opening and closing of cupboards. Monday morning brought a tentative knock on my door. When I opened it, I found Karen standing there, looking considerably less formidable than usual. Her hair was tied back in a simple ponytail rather than set in its usual rigid style, and she wore jeans instead of her customary pearls and twin set. In her hands was a Victoria sponge cake. She began awkwardly, "I made this. For Mrs. Henderson. And for you, if you'd like some." She thrust the cake toward me. "It's my grandmother's recipe. The jam is, well, it's store-bought, but it's a good brand." I accepted the cake with appropriate solemnity. "I'm sure Mrs. Henderson will appreciate the gesture." Karen nodded jerkily. I withdraw my complaints. All of them. And I called the solicitors to tell them I won't be pursuing any cases. That's very generous of you. She fidgeted with the sleeve of her jumper. I may have overreacted. A bit. About some things. We all get carried away sometimes. I offered diplomatically. Yes, well. She took a deep breath. I've been thinking about what you said. About rules being meant to serve people, not the other way around. I nodded encouragingly. I moved here because I wanted to be part of a traditional English village, she continued. In Kensington, everything was always changing. New people, new shops, new rules every time you turned around. Nothing felt stable or permanent. Change can be unsettling, I agreed. But I think I've been focusing on the wrong things. The traditions that matter aren't about driveway widths or the exact shade of a door. They're about, well, community, like you said. She glanced up at me hesitantly. Do you think? Would it be possible to start over? As neighbors? I considered her for a moment. Karen had made my life rather difficult these past weeks. She'd filed false reports, tried to have me arrested, threatened legal action, and generally been a thorn in my side since the day she moved in. But I'd faced far worse in my career. And unlike those threats, this one was standing on my doorstep with a peace offering and what appeared to be genuine remorse. I think that's an excellent idea, I said, extending my hand. James Wright, retired Queen's Guard. Pleasure to meet you. Relief washed over her face as she shook my hand. Marjorie Winters, recent London transplant with a lot to learn about village life. Well then, Marjorie, would you like to come in for tea? We can share this cake, and you can tell me what made you want to move to Millfield in the first place. And so began a tentative peace between us. The cake, despite its store-bought jam, was actually quite good. As we talked, I discovered that beneath the rigid exterior was a woman who had recently lost her husband of 30 years and was desperately trying to create order in a world that suddenly made no sense to her. Rules and regulations were her way of establishing control when everything else felt chaotic. By the time Mrs. Henderson came over to investigate, having been texted by Mr. Henderson, who had spotted Karen entering my cottage, the three of us were deep in conversation about the village's upcoming summer fete. Karen, it turned out, had been an event planner in her professional life and had plenty of ideas that didn't involve measuring tape or regulatory codes. You know, Mrs. Henderson said thoughtfully as she accepted a piece of cake, the fete committee is short a member this year. Edith's hip replacement has put her out of commission. Karen perked up visibly. I'd be happy to help if you think people wouldn't mind. Mind? Dear, they'd be thrilled. We've been running the same events for 15 years. A few new ideas might be just what we need. And that's how Karen's energy was finally channeled into something constructive. The summer fete that year was the most successful in village history, featuring a baking competition judged blindfolded, Karen's idea, which Edith reluctantly admitted had merit, a military precision egg and spoon race organized by some of my former colleagues, and a historical display about the village's evolution that showed how even the most traditional places change over time. D.S. Phillips brought his father to the fete, and Colonel Phillips and I spent a pleasant afternoon reminiscing while judging the Best Village Character contest, won by Mr. Jameson and his artistic great-grandson, whose garden gnome collection had mysteriously expanded to include one wearing a bearskin hat. Karen still measures things occasionally. Old habits die hard. But these days it's to ensure the fete tents are properly spaced or to help Mr. Jameson build a new raised garden bed at exactly the right height for him to tend without straining his back. The following spring, when my roses once again had the audacity to bloom enthusiastically over my garden wall, I found Karen admiring them one morning. They're breaking the containment regulation by at least 20 centimeters, she observed. I tensed slightly, old reflexes kicking in, until I spotted the twinkle in her eye. Shocking, I agreed solemnly. I should report myself immediately. Don't bother, she replied, carefully deadheading a spent bloom. I happen to know someone on the committee. I hear she's willing to look the other way in exchange for a cutting or two. I laughed and handed her my garden shears. Help yourself. Rules are meant to be bent occasionally, especially for neighbors. Indeed, she agreed, selecting a particularly vibrant specimen. Though I draw the line at your driveway. It really is scandalously wide. Blame Mrs. Harrington and her son's wheelchair. She glanced appraisingly at the offending gravel. I suppose some violations are more justifiable than others. Coming from Karen, this was practically a revolutionary statement. I considered it my greatest victory yet, far more satisfying than any arrest, though I still have all her legal threats and violation notices saved in a folder, just in case. After all, 22 years in the Guards teaches you to always be prepared and to keep your ammunition dry.